So React functional components and hooks is the topic. So there are two related things. React functional components have been around for a while. React hooks is fairly new, so new in fact that you would need the 0.91 SharePoint framework to automatically get the version of React that we need for React hooks, which is 16.8. So that's timely 1.91 release. Before, with the earlier releases, you'd have to fiddle around to get it to use a different version of the React framework, which isn't much fun. So that's me, boring slide, but there's my blog site. If you want to see, I've got an article where I describe this in more detail, and that's my Twitter handle. So why functional components? So normally when we build a React component, we use a class, and it's a derived class from React component. But there's another way of building a React component, which is just to make a simple function. And look how simple that is. It's simply a function that's got the name of the component and then a single argument, which is your props, and then you just return, and this would be in a TSX file, obviously, return the React elements that you want to render. Very clean, very simple, as Gordon Ramsay would probably say. You don't have any this and that and all those complexities. You can get a bit of kudos if you've got one of these hipster functional programmers who's done a science course and says, hey, man, you should be using functional programming or something. Well, yeah, kind of. JavaScript is kind of functional. Actually, it's not even a classical language, so it's not a natural fit to use classes in JavaScript or TypeScript. So this does fit better with the way the underlying language was constructed as a prototypal inheritance model. Very easy to test. It's a pure function, so the only thing that it depends on is the properties that come in, which is one of the arguments. So that's great. Now, of course, if you want to do something like state, and a lot of components are actually pure functions, but often you want some kind of state, and for that we have to introduce hooks, which is the problem that React hooks solve. So it might look like a fairly esoteric thing, but it does mean that your code is a lot cleaner and at least what's going on if you use this functional component approach rather than classes. So let's look at what happens if we were to run the Yeoman generator. So now you should see my PowerShell window. So we have the drill. If I go up a level, I do yo at Microsoft/SharePoint, and you've probably seen this 1,000 times. And I build just using the out-of-the-box Yeoman generator, and we go through, we answer all the questions, and eventually it says, do you want to use the no JavaScript framework, Knockout or React? You're going to pick React. Why wouldn't you? And I'm not going to go through all this, but eventually that would generate this project in Hello World. And if I open the editor in there, this is what you'll see because it's a React web part, you get a components library or subdirectory, and then in there's a TSX file. I assume everybody's familiar with React, and you get this strange syntax where it returns all the divs, and this magical TSX compiler comes and composes it all and turns it into valid TypeScript and ultimately JavaScript. But it's a class based on React component. So if I wanted to make that a functional component, what I could do is, and nobody's suggesting you should go in and refactor everything to do this, but you could say export default function hello world, and then I just pass through the props. I could make those strongly typed if I wanted to, and then I don't need to do a render method because it's not a class. It's just going to return. I've got an extra closing brace which I can get rid of, and simplify that into a React functional component. So all this is doing is returning all this. I have to change this as now there's no this anymore. So that, again, that's a simplification. So I just return the props. And if you want to be really clever, you could use an array destructuring, an object destructuring operator here, and what that does is you could just pass that as a description. I'm going to come back to this destructuring a bit later. That's just a feature of the language. It's nothing to do with the making it a functional component. Right. So I've got an example. So if you go let's go to the top. So I go to the SharePoint under GitHub. So GitHub/SharePoint, and then there's a library called or a project called SPFx web parts, and you can download that. Be aware that that's about 1 GB now. So you might want a sparse checkout if you just wanted a few samples. But if I go down into samples, I've actually got a few here which are all starting with React-fun. And React functional component, this is the simplest one, which is just going to be like the Hello World web part. So I've built one here. So if you want to download that and try it, you can do. I'll just show you what it looks like. So it's this functional component, Hello World. I've actually strongly typed the properties. This is not a huge difference, but it is significantly simpler, and as we get into more complicated examples, the story gets better. But look how quickly I can write using a functional component, a new component in here. So if I want to say my component name, give it a property equals Bill, and I can just define it up here, or I could do it in a separate file if I wanted to. So I'm going to, all I have to do is function my component, and then the props, and then h1 and hello props dot, was it name, wasn't it? And I've just written another React component, and I can even argue it just from memory, so it just simplifies things a surprising amount. And if you want to see what that one looks like, well, it just renders exactly the same. Just before I save that, it will render the same. And go to React Fun. Let's use that one, and I'll do a gulp serve here. Hope I haven't got one running somewhere else. Just check I haven't accidentally left something running in the other window now. So that will fire up, and in the workbench, and if I load that web part up, it just looks like the normal out-of-the-box web part. And just to prove that that change I just made, if I save that, it should reload, shouldn't it? Looks as though it's reloading. And when that refreshes, looks as though it's working. And now it says hello Bill, because I've got that extra component that I added in there. Right, now that's great, but typically what we want is something that's got some state in it. And although, as I say, a lot of components, the smaller components might be pure like that, we often need to work with state. So I've got another example here called Roman numerals, and if I just go to that one, and I'll kill this. Go up a level and go into, so this example, they're all in the samples library, and this one is called React Functional Component Stateful, and I'll do a gulp serve of this one as well. So all you need to do is go to that samples library, download it, and then you'll need to do an npm install, and then it will all be there and ready to run. There are instructions on how to run these samples on GitHub as well. So this is the Roman numerals web part. So this has got a little bit of state in it. So what happens here is I've got an input box here, and when I change the values in this text box, the Roman numerals below change, come back. And if I go to edit the web part, I've actually got a couple of extra controls that I added just to make it a little bit more exciting. And I can, I've got some captions and things that I can put in there. And so now that I've done that, I can use that increment and decrement counter. So this component has state. It needs to know what the user's entered and what state it's in. It's not purely dependent on the properties, which we pass it through these controls in the web part settings. So let's look at the code behind that. So this is my Roman numerals web part, Roman numerals.tsx, and what we have here is so it's still a functional component, but in order to support state on line 11, I've used this feature called React hooks. Now, React hooks has a number of methods. They all start with the word use. So there are about 10 that come out of the box, as it were, for hooks, and then you can write your own as well. So you can bundle functionality into these as well. So, I obviously haven't got time to go into it in much detail, but if you want to learn more, if you just Google for React hooks, you'll find a full explanation of how it works and how you use it. And this is a sort of the direction that React is going at the moment. But it's a new enough feature that you need the latest version of the SharePoint framework to be compatible with it. So this is what this function useState does is it takes an argument which is an initial value, and I've actually taken one of the properties to provide that initial value, and then it returns a tuple. And so remember that spread operator, well, I use an object destructuring operator. This is an array destructuring operator that I'm using here that spreads those two elements into these two constants. So there's all that's really happening. I could have written this just as well as foo, then just say, value equals var value equals foo 0 is equivalent to what we've done there. So, and the same with the second one. So it returns the value and then a setter, which is a function, of course. So that setter is equivalent to in state, you'd have a set state function. If we were using a class-based React component, we'd use set state. We'd have to set things up in the constructor, and we might well find we had to do things in some of these component did mount and component did unmount methods as well. There might be some complexity around that too. So this is really very simple. So just a one line, this handles state for me. I can have other states as well. If I had another variable called foo, I could call that foo and set foo. The names are immaterial. I can call them what I like, but the convention is to call it the variable name and then a setter, prefix that with set. So that's how that works. So now when I go into the input control, you can see the value is being picked up from value. There's no this and there's no this variable that I have to worry about whether I've got the right one or not and things like that. And I've also got an onChange method or function that I've defined up here, which uses that set value to set the new value. So as I go into the input control, it sets the state to a new value, and that causes a re-render. And then I've also got, if I choose to show these up-down buttons, then I've got an on-click event, and I've used, that could be a function as well, but I happen to have used a lambda expression that then uses a set value to increment the value. So very simple, a very simple function actually that does a reasonable amount. So that's my second example where we have state, and I've got a third one, which is also quite interesting. So I go up a level and go into React functional with data fetch, and in this example, so if I do a gulp serve on this one, and we can have a look at that. I've actually loaded it up already in another window, which will save me running it as long as I don't refresh the page or anything. This is the Teams tracker. So what that is doing is, so this one I can't run in the workbench because I have no context to work with. So what it's doing is it's running inside a tenant in the tenant workbench, and it gives me a list of all the teams I'm a member of. And then I've also got a toggle here which shows the channels for each team. So when I click on that, it's actually making another request using Patrick's PNP.js library, of course, to populate these so that the team members, sorry, the team channels are shown as well. So let's look at the code behind that one. So this is the Teams tracker, and I look at the Teams tracker control itself first. So again, I've used use state, so a React hook to manage a Teams list state variable, and we've got a set Teams list. And the second thing, the second type of hook we've used here is one called useEffect, which is intended for things that involve side effects, and that's why it's called useEffect. And what we do there is we pass the React useEffect a function. In this case, I've used a lambda. I could also spell it out as a function if I wanted to, which has no parameters, but it calls the graph. So back up here, somewhere I've set this up on init in the sort of the higher level, the actual web part. The web part, of course, has to be class-based because it's extending a base client-side web part, and then it's got an on init method where I set up the PNP.js graph library, and then down in the Teams tracker component itself, I'm using that, and in this callback, it goes and gets the teams and then uses that setter on the state to update the list of teams. So when the control is first rendered, it's going to trigger this. It will pass through this useEffect, and then when that callback returns, it will then update the control. So you'll see a spinner, which I think I've set somewhere. I can't remember where it is. I think there's a spinner. Here it is. Yes, that it shows until that teams list gets updated, and then once the teams list is populated with an array of teams, it then maps that and outputs a series of list elements with each team, and that itself is another control which we'll look at in a second. So the one thing to watch out for here is, you see I've put this second argument to useEffect, which is quite important, because just think about what happens here. Every time this Teams tracker gets rendered, it calls this, and what would happen is it would call this every time. It would then go and fetch the data and set the teams list variable, and because that's like set state in React, then it will trigger a re-render of the component, and you get a nasty infinite loop if you don't do something to say only do it the first time. So what this empty array says is I'm conditional on nothing, and the consequence is it only calls this the first time that the component is rendered, and it populates this list. And then the list of teams is, each team is rendered using this separate team component. So if we go into the team component itself, it's very simple actually. It too has state, which is the list of channels, which might be empty depending on whether this show channels property is true or not. So that ultimately comes from the property pane when we set up the properties of the web part. And then it'll either set the channels list to an empty list if we're not showing the channels, or it'll go off and get the teams. Now, just a little side note, it might not be efficient to do that, but it's for the purpose of the demonstration. I think it's useful to do it that way. You might decide that the cost of making that call is too high and I want to cache it somewhere, and there are lots of ways of doing that as well. But just for the sake of this demonstration, we're actually, when that gets shown, it's going to go up off, and each of these teams is going to populate itself, which keeps it nice and contained. And then again, once I've got a channel list, I'll use a map function to then output an array of list elements with the individual channels in. And in this case, I'm dependent on whether I'm showing channels or not. So this is something that the user can change through the web part property panel, property pane. So I need to be aware. You see, that's coming in as one of the props. But if that changes, I need to make sure that this use effect knows that and gets called again. So this is really just an array of dependencies of what use effect is doing. So all of that, it would have taken a lot of fiddling around with lots of methods and did mount and did unmount, and you'd have to think about, well, I know, what do I do if the user changes this show channels, and I have to go and deal with all this. It all ends up being a lot simpler using this approach. So, you know, it might not be obvious on this first initial glance, but I would encourage you to go and find out a bit more about it. First of all, get up to speed with SPFx 1.91. You can download these samples, and they will work with even if you've got an earlier version of the SharePoint Framework generator installed, or you can, because it will just do an npm install, so that's not a problem. But if you're doing it from scratch and you want to start using this approach, I wouldn't go and refactor everything to use functional components and React hooks. That's totally unnecessary, but you might choose to. I have actually refactored a lot of my code using that because the resulting code is so much cleaner and so much nicer that I've kind of got hooked on this approach. Anyway, learn about React hooks. Don't forget there's Google for React hooks, and try those samples that I've got on GitHub, and let's write some cleaner code, everybody. Hope you like it, and there's some links as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Bill. Great demo. Hopefully that will encourage lots of folks to try out hooks.